Well, I'd like to welcome everybody to Alaska Book Week. And I have to say that it is a wonderful event that is the result of Trish Jenkins, a colleague and friend of mine, and her extraordinary energies. She is really the original of the Energizer Bunny. My name is Toby Widdicombe. I'm a professor in the Department of English at UAA, and I've been there very happily for 3 decades now. And I'm talking with Kerry Feldman, who also happens to be from UAA and is an emeritus professor of anthropology and the former dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. And we're talking about writing, and we're talking in particular about his new novel that just came out, which is called Alice's Trading Post. I have to say, full disclosure, in addition to both being from UAA, both being from CAS, Kerry was actually also dean when I was there, and he was extraordinarily good at that particular job and is much missed. So, Kerry, do you want to talk about yourself a little bit before we get underway with the novel?
Well, Toby, it's good to see you again.
You too.
Changed a little bit.
Get grayer, right?
Thanks to Trish, also a great professor of English, Jenkins, for setting this up. And this book week is a wonderful idea. It's a Library of Congress activity, I see, and there's a state organization, Center for the Book, and I'm very proud that to be part of it. So thank you. I'm an anthropologist from Montana originally, and I never heard of the word anthropology growing up, but I hitchhiked through Europe when I was 24, and I wanted to see where America came from. So I've always been a curious guy, and I really have to see it myself to understand it. And I lived on $5 a day, and I could speak a little French, and the guy I hitchhiked with could speak fluent Spanish. So we lived on $5 a day. And I ended up eating lunches of, I'd have an orange and some bread on a park bench. And there was always a little old French lady was sitting next to me. And we would talk in French, and she would tell me her life stories. And I became interested then in people. It's an interesting thing. And I wanted to find out where I came from. So I went into anthropology. I became an applied anthropologist and came up here in '73. I've always wanted to be a writer since I was 7. My mother was a school teacher in a one-room place in Terry, Montana, in Prairie County. And her mother said, "Peaches, you think you're too good for us. You want to go to college. You should just have babies and get married. Or maybe you get married and have babies." And she taught me to read and to write, and I became fascinated with reading. But I didn't, and I actually published a poem when I was 7. Maybe the teacher did it. And I won writing contests when I was a teen, but I always had other people doing it for me. I didn't know anything, so I wanted to learn something and then be a writer. So that's my background. And this book, I should probably stop talking here, but I began working on it 30 years ago. And although I'm from Montana, I didn't know much history about Montana. And I've done a lot of work with Alaska Natives, and I dedicate this book to Native American mothers, daughters, and grandmothers whose courage inspires me, and it really does. I've interviewed scores, and the disrespect that they went through and the courage is just amazing. And I was reading about what happened to the Lakota and Cheyenne after the Custer battle. And I realized I didn't know what happened. And I was furious at myself. And I said, I'm going to change that. I'm going to write a book. And first I'm going to understand it. And so it took me 200 books and essays. And it took me a lot of research. And then after I retired, I worked with a woman in California who taught writing. And Tony Lapopolo. And for 5 years, we worked sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph. And the whole first draft of this thing I threw away because it was just trite. And one day I was taking a shower and I heard this voice of this old lady.
Mhm.
And this sounds weird, but I had a muse. I even opened the shower to see who the hell is that? I mean, I'm not that kind of a guy. And I went downstairs, took everything I wrote, threw it away, and I said, tell me who you are. And that's Alice.
So I'm curious, Kerry, as to whether or not you thought about not doing this as fiction, right, but doing it as nonfiction. Did that ever occur to you in the 30-year history of this creation to do it nonfiction?
Would you tell me again the question?
Well, the question is, you said you always wanted to be a writer. You said you've been working on this book for 30 years. And so was there ever a point in the history of this document that you thought about making nonfiction and not fiction?
I'll tell you, no. It would take a lot more research. You have to be a historian to do this nonfiction. You would have to know a lot more than I know. What did occur to me is that the history is so crazy, much crazier than this book, that I had to talk to one of my local mentors, Sandra Clevin, who kind of discovered me with Michael Burwell as a writer, and I started writing for the Cirque Journal, and she said, and I did a book of short stories, and I also have done a noir, a murder mystery for them. But I said, Sandy, why do I write? I mean, fiction, and these people are suffering today. I just don't think it's right. I mean, this is after 30 years of writing with this book, and she reminded me that fiction allows you to tell truth at a deeper level.
I agree.
So that's what I'm doing. Yes, it did occur. It occurred to me. The question occurred, but never to. Now I've written, I have essays in 3 books about anthropology. I've published a lot of anthropology. I've published a lot of nonfiction. And I'm a hard-nosed empiricist, and but fiction is a different part of my brain, and it took being retired to really let loose. And Tony Lopopolo, she's a woman, Tony Tio, she would say to me, "What does Alice smell? What does she taste? What does she feel?" And I was writing too much about what happened. And she said, Kerry, if you're going to write a novel, she said, it's the most difficult thing you've ever done. It's more difficult than a PhD in anthropology. And she was right. PhD in anthropology, you have your data and you interpret it, and there it is. You have your data. You're not inventing it. But in fiction, it's a blank piece of paper. And she said, you have to engage today with readers in IM. And I said, what's IM? Interior monologue. So I did. So you know what Alice is thinking, but I tell you, some of those things that I went into, Toby, I have to stop writing and I go outside and cry. And if I think about it now, I will. I mean, it's just so sad. What the hell happened? And it was so funny. Now, the only way these natives have survived is their humor, and that book is funnier than hell. And my native friends have said, I laughed. That's off. So fiction, nonfiction. The fiction, the nonfiction is crazier than any fiction.
Sure. And I agree with you about the challenge of writing fiction. It is using a different part of the brain. It's got challenges that are greater than those associated with writing academic arguments or nonfiction about this, that, and the other. Very true. Do you want to give the audience, the viewers, a sense of what the novel is like by maybe reading out the beginning of it?
Yes, I would. Now, this is published by 5 Star Press in Maine, and the reason I submitted it to 5 Star is I went online to see who won the Spur Award for the best historical novel in 2019. And it was a guy named Gordon Allberg who published 5 Star. So I sent it to 5 Star. Guess what? They sent it to Gordon Allberg.
Huh. Huh.
And they said, should this be published? And he said, yes. And then they said, you edit it. Gordon Allberg was my editor, and he is a crusty old, he thinks he's older than I am. I'm a little older than he is, but Canadian. And I mean, he's forgotten more about fiction and writing than I'll ever know. He's published 20 books, but he published romance novels because they said only a woman can write them. And he said, I can do it.
That's nonsense. Yeah.
He really helped me. And he said, I said, hey, can I use that? That's on the back of the book. Critical acclaim for Alice's Trading Post. He wrote to me at the end of this month of working together, the storytelling is magical, lyrical, top-notch.
Yeah, I agree with him. Absolutely.
I had no, anyway, so, and I didn't even know I'd written a historical novel. I said, Tony, what did I write? I just wanted to write a novel. She said, Kerry, for God's sake, it's a historical novel. You have real people in there. By the way, the first version of this thing I gave to my dad to read because I wanted to honor his love of, I never read Westerns, although I went to every Western movies ever made. And I believed in the myths of the West, and I had to give them up, a lot of them. But he said, son, this is the best novel I've ever read, but it's not a Western. And you really should not have real, these people that you're writing about have children today. So I had to change some names, but anyway. So Alice's Trading Post. Prologue. Alice's Trading Post burned to the ground on Beaver Creek outside Buffalo Gap in 1995. A metal box under the charred pine floor contained a woman's moccasins resting on recordings made by our dear friend, Homer Half-Big Phipps, 95 years of age. Mr. Phipps was a Native American volunteer veteran in World War I at age 17 and was our dear, irascible friend. He made notes and recorded stories of his grandmother, whom we knew as Miss Alice, who gave us ginger snaps when visiting her post. He passed away in the fire. He wanted the stories of her life added to those told, he said, quote, by soldiers, miners, historians, and the endless trail of suck-ups coming to these parts, end of quote. Our society transcribed her stories in its notes as he wished and put them in a sequential order, honoring his wishes. Buffalo Gap Historical Society, Buffalo Gap, South Dakota, 2019. Chapter 1. Oh, well, first we got part 1. Willamette Valley, Columbia River, Oregon Territory, 1874. Hold it right there, Bear. The bear caught wind of my first woman moon. Before I could shoot, he lifted his curious eyes away from the white oak acorns he'd knocked from low limbs. Going on 13 snows, I never thought my life would change like it did when I became a woman. He came at me with grizzly claws, teeth, and a roar. My woman blood wanted to crawl back inside me, but I tried to stay calm and took aim at the bear's nose. The only place to bring him down with one shot except the shell in his eye. Shells bounce off a bear head like pine cones. A carbon jammed to grab the barrel, waved the metal like a club, and yelled how Chub taught me. Hey, wahoo, get! The bear hesitated and gave thought to what I said. The thought held little interest. He got his anger on and roared at me again. So that's the beginning of the novel. She's 13 years old. She begins her woman moon. And I had a former student of mine who I thank in this book read it and tell me what she thought it was about. She said it's about becoming a woman, and I could identify with it. It didn't matter what she is or not. So that's beginning. That's Alice.
That's a beautiful opening. It's a beautiful opening because it gets the reader right into the action, right? And I think that's important. One of the strengths of this novel for me is it is one episode after another episode after another episode. It never lets up. And yet at the same time, you manage to contextualize it, to have a lot of philosophically interesting things to say along the way.
Yeah, that now I have to thank Leonard Elmore a bit for that. He's a great writer. He wrote Hombre, and when he did some westerns, then he wrote Hollywood Confidential, and he gave his 10 rules for how do you write a book that people want to read. The first one is cut out all the stuff that people don't want to read. And that's the literary stuff that guys want to put in. It's like, I'm really smart, I know a lot of stuff, I'm going to put it in there. And the other thing was my fiction mentor would say, that's you in there, take that out. So none of me is in there. It's all Alice and her friends. And
yeah, you actually do inhabit her personality. That's a real gift, I think. If you hadn't inhabited her personality, then it would have been Kerry Feldman writing about Alice, which is not what comes across at all. And for the purposes of the novel, you're Alice. It's quite an interesting transformation. It really is.
Very interesting. Yeah, I'm glad you noticed that. I did ask Phyllis Fast, a colleague of mine, should I do this? Should I finish it? She's at the Baskin, Coyoacán, brilliant writer, brilliant lady, PhD, Harvard. And she said, yeah, you got to finish it. And she read some chapters. It's good. And my mentor, I'd say to Tony, I said, is it legit for a man to write as a woman? I mean, I'm kind of aware of this. And she said, hey, the first modern novel, Madame Bovary, written by a guy.
Yes.
He said, don't worry, it's how you do it. And this is what Phyllis said. She said, Kerry, today anybody can write about anything. It's how do you do it? So I had a lot of help. And I was interviewed on something called, it's this guy, a national, international interview thing on Zoom some time ago. And what was I? I thought, I forget what I was going to say. I'll come back.
Well, let me ask you this question. And you sort of asked me this yesterday in an email. Questions that I might be interested in talking about. And I do want to focus on this question of what is a Western and why your novel is not a Western in the Zane Grey tradition, let's say, in the most cliched way. But it's interesting, you don't totally give up the idea that this is a Western because you cleverly call this novel in a subtitle, a novel of the West. You're making a distinction, I think, it seems to me, between this genre of the Western novel and a novel about the West. And I'm curious if you talk us a little bit about how you see those two as different.
That's a great question. In our home, and after we moved from Terry to Billings, my mother insisted we have a library downstairs. I mean, we didn't have a lot of money. We have a library. My dad had every Zane Grey novel written and every Louis L'Amour novel written. And by the way, Tony LaPopolo, when she was a young girl, worked with Louis L'Amour and was his closest. Yeah, and she bought Gene Autry's horse. And she's an Italian. So, I mean, yeah, so I had, anyway, I never read Westerns. I didn't like them. I like J.D. Salinger.
Very different from Westerns, yeah.
And but I did like the Western movies. I did like Little Big Man. Was probably the first Western I just turned me on. And there's a Little Big Man in this. We could talk about.
Yes. That. Yes.
And I began to understand what a picaresque novel is, and it was a word I wasn't aware of. But that's what Don Quixote is also, where you're kind of poking fun at it a little bit. but you still show respect. And also
Mhm.
Lonesome Dove started out as a picaresque novel about some two washed up rangers who steal cows, and it ended up a Western. And those kind of Westerns emphasize what is now called the myth of the West.
Mhm.
And I've got to be careful about that because my book is being considered for awards for Westerns by people that I respect, that wear cowboy hats.
Hmm.
And it's not all myth, but a lot of this Western stuff came from the East Coast. And people from England, I mean, they were fascinated by it. And the Indians are always bad. They're always savages. And the women were just there. They were just hangers on. And they forget that they stole this land from these native people. And even John Wayne said they were selfish. These people, they had all this land. They didn't need it all.
Huh.
And
That's John Wayne for you, yeah.
yeah, but yet he's a hero to people. So it's not a traditional Western. I have a friend who might want to read, well, I won't mention his, well, in Idaho, Ron McFarland helps me with some stuff. He's an English professor down there, and he knows a lot more than I do about writing, MFA prof. And he asked me that question, and he said, I think it's not a Western with a small T tradition or a capital T. It's a modern Western. And since the 80s and 90s, there's been a lot of Western writers who take on some of these myths and change things a little bit. So I don't know if I've answered your question.
Yeah, you have answered it, Kerry, and I'll just sort of illustrate maybe what I'm hearing from you and use a different genre to illustrate it. So I think your novel bears the same relation to the traditional Western novel as, say, Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed bears to science fiction.
Beautiful, beautiful. She was the daughter of Alfred Kroeber, who's an
Very good point.
Yeah, anthropology. By the way, science fiction. I taught a course called Anthropology Through Literature for 3 decades in the 80s.
I did not know that.
And I use science fiction, anthropology through science fiction. If you really get into human cultures, which is another conversation, the only way to really understand human cultures is that it's a bunch of science fiction. The things that human beings believe about reality is so far from reality that it blows your mind. But if you don't accept these things, Toby, you become insane.
Yes.
I mean, 80% of Russians support Putin, you know, of the old people. That's insane. I mean, 40% of, well, so I do have a memoir that I'll probably offer soon. It's called Self-Discovery in Lands Far Away. It's how I discovered I had a culture, and it was just as arbitrary and made up and wacko as the cultures I studied. I do have something I might publish, a letter to the editor. Got to be careful. Where does this idea of a soul?
Ourselves a little bit, but let me ask you this question, because you're talking about, well, I might publish memoir, I might publish something else. So has it occurred to you? I'll back up a second. The thing that makes me know that this is a really good novel is that I want to know more about Alice. It's simple as that, right? And although you point out that she lives to 103, I don't think I'm spoiler alert here, but I'll give these away. She dies at 103 in 1966. So this whole swathe of her life, which presumably takes place in the trading post, presumably is absolutely fascinating, only that's another novel. So I'm curious if you've thought at all about a sequel and what it might look like.
I did originally when I decided to do this, and I got to know her family a little bit, that she had this daughter who was beautiful, but she had, due to starvation up in Canada, she couldn't see very well. And then I was going to have her, I was going to write a novel about her, or maybe from her, and she was sent to boarding school. And I was going to take on all that boarding school stuff. And then I was going to have Half Big Homer tell his story. So there was going to be a trilogy, but I realized it would take me another 30 years to do each of them. And I can't speak for Native Americans. This is my view of what happened on the land where I grew up in Terry, Montana, and I played sports against the Crow, and I admired them very much. And it's my view of the land where I grew up, and she's, you know, part white. I can't tell their story, and it's just coming out now. This the atrocities that were done to these people, sending to make them white. Now, I do have some research coming out that in an anthropology journal pretty soon about a particular boarding place in Alaska. I won't mention it now, where Native kids went and what was done to them. And the goal was to make them white. And one of the ways you did that was Christianity. And so, yes, I did think about it. And then I decided, no, that's their story. I'm going to let them write it. But I did want to pave the way for Native Americans to write about more than their group. It is immoral for Native Americans, I discovered as an anthropologist working with our Alaska Native students, to do what you're supposed to do as an anthropologist for your study. You must study someone other than you because you're biased. And they said that's immoral. I have to write about me. So now we're into decolonizing methodologies, which is our Steve Langman and I and Phyllis Fast and others in our department exposed our students to this immediately, that this Western notion of what science is very Western. It's very, and I would say it's very male. It's very individualistic, and has our whole notion of truth. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff here, but I can't tell their stories. But I did want to say, maybe you guys could start writing about this kind of stuff I'm doing. The other thing is you can't write about in a Western is sex. And I thought, and Tony Lepopolo said, look, you have them married. You have to write something about this. And I said, well, I don't want to.
I was wondering if this was going to become a subject. Yeah.
You've got to.
Because the sex in this novel is it's very funny, actually. It's repeatedly very funny, and I really like it for that, because there wasn't a sense in this novel that somehow, oh, I'm Kerry Feldman, I'm writing a novel, so I've got to have a sex scene in here. The sex evolves very naturally and convincingly from particular circumstances that the characters go through at a certain moment. So I think it works really well.
Well, thank you. It's a risk, but you know, I would like Native Americans to be able to write. It's very difficult to find anything ever written about the sex life of people in the 1900s. I mean, the only thing I read is it's matter of fact. Well, Crazy Horse, the great Lakota leader, a man whom I admire, he never took scalps. He was in love with this girl, and they were going to get married, and her father married her to somebody else to make peace with this clan, and he came back from a hunting trip and she was gone. Now, I've had my heart broken as a young man by a girl, and I know what he went through. And he after 3 years, and she had some kids, he went over to that place and stole her. He was a shirt wearer. That meant he was supposed to uphold all the beliefs, and to be a Lakota means to live a holy life. We don't know that, and it's in that book. To be Lakota is to walk in a holy way. And of course, stealing horses from the Crow is holy, but you know, sanctity depends on the religions. They have all these religions have these wacko notions about what makes you holy, like don't eat. Why the heck is that holy? You know, but and so no water. Her husband came and got her and shot him in the face. you're telling me that they had a sexual relationship that was
Uh-huh.
perfunctory, and I mean, it wasn't romantic.
Uh-huh.
My other goal in this book, besides helping people understand what happened after the Custer battle, was to experience Native Americans as I experienced them, as people.
Mhm.
People. It's like you're a people first. Secondly, you're a Brit or whatever the heck you
Yeah.
are.
Uh-huh.
And
Uh-huh.
black, and I've had my black friends say, well, no, the first thing you notice is color. And I said, it's just the way I was raised. I can't explain it. Joe Louis was my hero when I was loved boxing when I was 6. I was taught to be boxing and fight. And then Jackie Robinson, and then Mahatma Gandhi when I was 18. And so these are strange heroes. Also Phil Rizzuto, shortstop for the Yankees. But so I'm trying to also say that the Native Americans could write this stuff that I wrote. I mean, they get close to it. And it's going to be interesting when some really great Native American writers, and they are great ones, read this to see if it's going to be accepted and what they think.
I'm very curious to see about that. Yes.
That's the ultimate to me. And you know, I mentioned that to my mentor, and she in California, she said, well, how many books do they buy? So it's like, we shall see. It's going to be mixed. Now, I do have a couple Native American friends in the lower 48 who've read it, and they're passing it around to their friends. They love it.
Well, this raises another question, actually, as you talk about, you know, how it's going to get received by Native Americans, and obviously your degree of concern with that, and your concern with, do you do a successful job of looking at the world through female, not male eyes? If you had to do this again, would you have changed anything significant in the novel? Or are you happy with it as it is?
I don't even think I wrote it. It's so good. This woman dictated it. It's like I couldn't have done. How did I do that? And I will tell you this. I kind of got, after I'd written it, I thought, people are going to say, Kerry, you're a man. You can't write as a woman. Kerry, you're not a Native American. You can't write about this. So I thought, well, the story's so good. Here's what I'll do. I have another version of this novel. It might be illegal for me to publish it. It's called Alice, Half Big and Me. And it's a postmodern novel inspired by something I experienced when I was 24 at Harvard at the Charles Theater, in which I saw Theater of the Absurd, 6 characters in search of an author.
Yes.
By Pirandello. And it was so brilliant, so brilliant. These characters come and said, this guy thought of us, and then he didn't finish it. And we want to finish what happened to us. It was terribly painful. And, but I love the idea. So he's breaking the fourth wall. I mean, he's just terrible, you know, is it fiction? So I said, I want to write something like that someday.
So do you actually have a manuscript of that, or is that just
done?
It's
done. And I asked my publisher, hey, am I going to get in trouble if I try and publish this? And she said, well, I think the Library of Congress would have a problem giving you an ISBN number for a book in which the whole thing is in another book, but each chapter has a different. But here's what happens. The characters come in and dialogue with me, and I explain how I learned about these people. I mean, Half Big and I would drink scotch at night, and he'd tell me stories, and I'd argue with him. And then Alice would come and say, I'm going to have this gay Indian in there. It's like, there's no damn gay Indian in my novel. I mean, there were no gay Indians in the straight arrow shredded wheat biscuit things that I would, for breakfast, I would buy so that I could see what Straight Arrow said about how to hunt and trap and walk. And then so it gets very postmodern-y. And I wrote it in there also for English professors. I thought, you know, they know everything. I mean, you know more than I'll ever know about writing. So I'll put something in that would appeal to them. It's not just a Western. I dialogue with my muse, but my muse knows what I'm thinking, and I can't fool her, and it drives me crazy. and this old lady, and then Medicine Feet Woman, this gorgeous wife of Lone Wolf, comes. And in this story, when she was running around with that soldier that kills Crazy Horse, she gets pregnant. She's pregnant. And so she comes to me and she's pregnant. And I'm attracted to her sexually, and she's attracted to me. So do writers become, what's and it's hilarious. I mean, it's pretty funny. And so Alice comes in, and she's an old lady when she comes to me. She's this old lady, and her grandson is younger than she is, and Medicine Feet Woman is beautiful. So they all come at different times, and she says, "Get some sense. There's a baby in her." So,
as you say this, Kerry, it strikes me there's an analogy you can draw that's useful in the act of writing. So when you're writing creatively, the characters inhabit your mind and you become them in the same way that great actors are great actors, because the role that they play is not one they're playing at all. For that series of moments when they're that character, there's no difference, right? The difference is erased. You think about this with Kenneth Branagh, for example, as a great Shakespearean actor. He is not Kenneth Branagh playing a role. He is that person, whoever it may be. And the same thing for the time you write the novel, you're Alice. Otherwise, it wouldn't be convincing, I don't think.
You're right, and it's painful to do it. Also,
yeah.
I did have a little drama scholarship, and I did study screenplay writing at USC, so I do write screenplays also. But so here's what's difficult in that. I had to also be Mr. McFadden, that old Scott guy. Now he's based on a real character. You might not know this, so I don't know if I told you, but about 80% of that novel, as wacko as it is, happened. It really happened. And as I'm reading, it's like the history they're teaching of the West. I'm going to bring in this other history. It's true. And there was this, and I read this from Lewis Henry Morgan, this great New York lawyer who gave us Savagery, Barbarism, Civilization, and helped the Iroquois defend their rights and all that. He came to the West to see what was going on, and he wrote a journal. And he described Fort Union, in which they were selling whiskey to the Indians to get furs, 1850s, 40s, and this it was an old Scot who took 100 Native American women as wives. And Sitting Bull, as you read in that novel, shut it down, and he went to Fort Benton. So that guy's real. So I had to inhabit him. What kind of a man would do that? And these girls were being married off at 13, 14. I mean, they were young. That was very painful for me. And I could not understand, how could an old man view a child in that way? And I did my best. I did find a novel called, what was it called? Sold, S-O-L-D. A woman from Wisconsin, a writer who didn't like child trafficking, went to India and studied, I think it was India or Thailand, and studied, talked to ex-girls who had been put in brothels. Their families had sold them for money, and they finally escaped. And she wrote this thing about this girl had been traded. And so, that helped a little bit. But yeah, you inhabit your character. So I didn't want to make cardboard characters.
Right.
Bad guys have mothers, fathers, histories. And in the Westerns, in the old day Westerns, the bad guys are bad and the good guys are good. By the way, Gene Autry, played a guitar.
Oh, yes.
Roy Rogers. I wanted to be a cowboy when I was little, and I didn't know how to sing it. I did. But notice there's a singer in my Western. So I tried to honor all of those motifs. He's a Cheyenne. and
Mhm.
never trust a singing Cheyenne
I like that line.
with a secret.
One-liners. Yeah, I made a note of a lot of very funny one-liners, actually. So
Uh,
let me ask you this. You said at the outset that you've been working on this novel for 30 years. Now, I know enough about you to know that, as a retired professor, you're probably doing okay financially, not maybe great, but you don't have to write for money. So there's another need going on, right? The need is not, oh, like Walter Scott, I've got to make as much money as I can so that I can survive. What's the need? Why did you have to do this?
I'm an applied anthropologist, and I did it for this reason. I woke up. I was reading this book that I gave to my dad because I really didn't know that much about Montana history, and I sat up in bed at night. It was about 10 below outside in Anchorage, like 6 feet of snow. It was horrible winter, and after that battle, these Lakota starved in Wolf Mountain,
Yes,
and they were attacked by these soldiers in the wintertime, and the Cheyenne woman shot herself in the head, and they also stole their cows. When she goes down and pretend the Lakota stole their cows, I just explained how it happened. But I felt angry at myself
Mhm.
that I was as indifferent to Native Americans as anybody. What were they, objects to me? I mean, what? And I said, I know I'm gonna have people interested in them, in their history, and to respect them. I mean, they own this whole nation, and you
Yes.
stole it. And
Yes.
so I do take on Manifest Destiny in there, and a very wise writer, California, brilliant guy at USC, teaches fiction, taught fiction 30 years. Said, yeah, the readers are going to love that whacking Manifest Destiny, because that's part of the American myth.
Yes, it is.
And
Yeah.
I take it on. So, I might not be. So that's why. That's a good question. I mean, I felt compelled to deal with a character flaw in myself,
Mhm.
and I'm taking care of it.
Well, it's interesting, Kerry, you say that because I was thinking about this idea of compulsion. Obviously, you needed to write this novel. You had something very interesting to say, very enlightening for the reader to read. And yet at the same time, you're doing it obviously for yourself and not unselfishly for everybody else, although that's part of what's going on. And I'm thinking to myself, the piece that's really interesting is how much your early life was spent really close to the battlefield. That is probably the most famous battlefield in the long history of Native American and white aggression against Native Americans, right? Bighorn, that battle of Bighorn. And I wonder if you sort of talk about to what extent maybe in this novel you're going back to your own life, even though it gets expressed through the lives of characters who are very different from you. Does that make sense as a question?
Oh yeah, big time. I have a photograph of me. I'm about 1 year old, and I'm sitting on a blanket. That little Bighorn. That's the first picture of me after my Burt Reynolds nude, looking up on a bear rug. And I was taken there by my mother and my father. She's a homesteader's daughter, and he's the son of railroad people. And his brother, my Uncle Tuppy, who was very close to, he's a history major. By the way, he played basketball for the Silver Bobcats, the second greatest team at Montana State University in basketball, and he loved Custer. There's Custer County. If you see where Milestone is, Miles City, I used to go to Miles City all the time.
That's fascinating.
And I didn't know the history of the town. I didn't know the history of Terry. But whenever I go to a gas station, there's the Custer battle, and he's fighting. And sometimes with my sister, we'd play cowboys and Indians. She's a year younger. Sometimes I'd be Custer. Sometimes I'd be an Indian. I've been to that battlefield maybe a dozen times. I took my nephews there. I took Tammy there. By the way, my wife Tammy took a photograph of there's the Custer Hill where these last 30, 40 guys died. And, and right over the hill is a little marker to Cheyenne that died. And nobody paid attention. So she took a picture of that. And she took a black and white and she blew it up and she hand colored it. And she put some red in the soil. And she now it has a spear in it with an arrow hanging down. Their relatives put it there. And she framed it in a frame that had 3 inches on the front, and she put fake dirt in there and grass and a pair of moccasins.
Oh my God.
It's in the permanent collection of the Anchorage Museum of History and Art.
I've probably seen it. I just didn't register it by your wife.
They had it there she put it up there with a not for sale sign because she didn't want to sell Native American history. And this woman came up to her and said, "Congratulations, we bought your piece for like 300 or 400." She said, so she went over to our friend Don Moore to say, "Don, they bought this," and I told him it's not for sale. He said, "Well, I'll help you." Well, no, it had a sold sign on it. They went over and said, "Hey, who bought this?" And the lady said, "We did." And Tammy said, "Okay," but it doesn't have glass on it, so they never show it. But I've been there a dozen times. I've walked it, and there is a great video by this guy for the National Park Service about that battle. You can find it on YouTube. He's really good, and he tells it like he's white, but he tells it like it is. So, now Terry, I love the Yellowstone River. I swam the Yellowstone River. I fished the Yellowstone River. When I went to Milestown, they had the wooden Indian standing by the where you get your hair cut. I was really not aware of racial differences, and you know, in Montana, it took a lot to kind of let me understand the history of America. And I love Eastern Montana. I love the plains. I love the flatland. When we went to places where there are mountains, it's like I can't see anything. And forests, it's like, we'll get rid of the trees. And I wanted to honor where I came from by telling the truth. And Tammy's her family's from South Dakota, so they took me and I visited the Black Hills and Buffalo Gap, and her brother lived there for a while. And and my father bought a movie theater in Terry called the Rialto, and I used to go there and help him clean up and watch. You could see 2 Westerns every week. So I had to honor that also, and I had to honor it by there's a stagecoach robbery. You know, there's shootouts. I've got all that stuff. I honored it's something like Lonesome Dove, where he's kind of saying, you know, this is kind of mythical, and then he gives his own version of it. And I mean, I hope my love and respect for the West comes out in a variety of ways, without whacking people over the head. The other thing that I wanted in that novel is what I experienced as a child, and I don't know if a Brit gets this. Wildness. I experienced wild. I experienced I experienced the prairie. I experienced wind and jumping. If I came to a river, I'd strip and jump in it. And you'd ride a horse, and so she says to this Two Jacks Perkins when they're in Yellowstone Park, and he says, "We want to preserve some of the wildness of the West." She says, "Two Jacks, you folks wouldn't know wild if it bit you in the arse. Indians know wild. They are wild, and I respect that. It's I don't know how else to explain it. I mean, civilization is supposed to make you tame. It removes a lot of your humanity. And by the way, Europeans didn't invent any civilization. It came from the Middle East. It came from Egypt.
That's right. And it came last to the British Isles as a result, because we're in extreme Northern Europe. So everything came late to us. But you don't want to admit this, but it's actually the case. Yes.
Yeah, but you know, those were tribes. I come from the Germani. They were tribes, and the Romans came up and they would fight each other. Well, they would have sex also on the borders. But you know, and the Germani learned how to build, you know, stone buildings and how to make, you know, metal and, you know, different stuff. But anthropologists, they usually like to study, you know, the exotic. And I did not become an anthropologist to study Indians. That's another thing. A lot of guys do. They were never exotic to me. They were people. I wanted to football and basketball. I had to guard Larry Prettyweasel. Google him.
Yes. I
held him to 27 points. He's still alive.
The fascinating thing, Kerry, is they were totally exotic to me growing up in England. And I remember one of the first books I bought as a teenager about the American West was the traditional American West model, right? So it's a lot about cowboys and a little bit about Indians kind of in the corner. Oh yeah, by the way, they completely creamed Custer, but let's not go into that. That's not the history of white people, or it is, but not so much. So you talk about a lot in this novel, and it's obvious from what you've already said about it, this is the case. So I have a couple of wearing my professor of literature hat questions for you. I don't know if you necessarily were really self-conscious when you did this, but I'm curious. There's this thing called a frame story. The most famous frame story of them all probably is the one that's part of Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And the frame story is basically the mechanism by which you get into the novel and then you get out of the novel again. And you've got a frame story here. So my question would be, why do you have it if you could take it out and you've still got 99% of the narrative? And a separate but related question is, you've got 4 sections here. And the 4 sections are Willamette Valley, My Sioux Life, My Hunkpapa Life, and This Earth Round, question mark. Do you want to talk about those structural issues? Why the frame story, and then why split it the particular way you split it?
What do you mean by frame story? You mean the thing burnt down? And
yeah, the thing burnt down, and then there's that bit at the end of the novel. This is again not frankly a spoiler alert, that there is italicized text at the end also, which talks about Alice Callahan dying at 103. So you have the very beginning part connected to the end part.
I wanted this novel to be in her voice. How could I do that in a way that literarily would be accepted? So that was my frame, is that she told it. Now, the other thing, I won't say much about it, but to whom did she tell it? What was his name? What's his first name?
Now, do you mean by this the grandson that she's writing it for?
What's his first name?
Tell me. Remind
Homer.
I should have spotted that. Yeah. Okay.
Homer. What does she name her daughter in English?
Tell me.
Helen. After Helen of Troy.
Oh, I know where you're going with this. Okay.
Two Jacks Perkins had a white horse that he rode. Okay. What was the name of his horse? It was a one-eyed.
You're quizzing me. How carefully did I read this?
No. I'm just, but nobody would notice it because I stuck some stuff in for professors. Now, Tony told me to take it out. I said, I'm not going to do it. Cyclops is the name of his horse.
Oh yeah, I got that. I definitely got that piece. Yes.
So Homer, she told her stories to Homer.
Interesting.
Yeah. And at the end of chapter 1, she says, that's the beginning of my troubles when I thought of myself troubles girl. Now, if you look up, I happen to study some Greek. If you look up the Greek meaning of Odysseus, it's man of troubles.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Yeah.
He experiences troubles and he
Mhm.
causes trouble to other people. So, and if you think about Sophocles, I mean, you know, he wrote a tragedy in which somebody killed his father. When I'm writing this, I mean, I've got all this Western basis of what a novel is. You talk about framing. So I'm just, I've got a big frame in the of this whole thing, and is kind of what to say. She's kind of a female Odysseus to me.
I agree with that. Definitely.
And she's looking for her home. She's trying to get home. Where do I belong? And the other thing is another person that wrote, so I threw this in for English professors too. Her mother's name is Molly because white men gave her that name. In the great Ulysses, the great novel.
Yeah, I got that too.
The last chapter is the soliloquy by Molly and Molly Bloom. And if you start looking at the end of my book, I mean, when her husband, Callahan, and her run off into the woods, he says, you know, she's like a flower in bloom. And I mean, I had to be careful. You can't be, if you're going to write something about the tragedy of people, you got to be careful about being too cute with stuff. And I just wanted to say, why can't we think of Native American life as having the I don't know, the spread of the tragedy of Greek tragedy upon which all Western civilization is based. So that's kind of what I'm doing in the big picture, is I'm trying to connect a Western to the origin of literature in the Western world. So
I thought it was fascinating that in the 4 sections you went with this question of is the Earth round, and I really like that because it's an interesting take on this whole flat Earth versus round Earth, and it looks at it from the Native American perspective. And I thought that was just fascinating that you could bring that in, and it doesn't have to be in there. What interests me about novels is when things are in there that at a narrative level don't have to be. So this is telling me a particular author is fascinated with that question.
I was blown away when I read that Crazy Horse thought about whether the Earth was round. Is it like the sun and the moon? I mean, when I was 7, a lot of stuff went on with me when I was 6 and 7. I would look at the moon at night in Montana, and I would say, I wish I could go there. Right. And I said, I would give up the last 10 years of my life if I could go to the moon and look at the Earth. That, you know, I wouldn't do that now, maybe, but
then it was easy.
And then we have this, you can never go home again, you know, the great novel. I mean, can you go home? And we can't go back. I mean, we can't give the land back to the rightful people. They can't go back to the way they were, and you can't go back and the other thing is life, like Plato said, an idea created by the first mover? There's a plan, you know, there's a plan to life. Or is it, like Shakespeare said, a tale told by an idiot? You'll feel the sound of fury signifying nothing. But the other guy that said that was Heraclitus. Philosopher said the earth is made of fire. It came from fire and it's going back into fire, which means everything is change. And as a boy growing up, there was no change. There were just the seasons. And I thought life would go on the way it was forever. And then change started to hit. We moved, we left Terry and went to Baker. I'd leave my friends and I left Baker. And I've gone through these changes. And anthropology began as a discipline in England. E.B. Tyler and the British, who were, you know, the beginning of racism, not the beginning of it, but man, they gave it to us big time. You know, all these colors, skins. They studied Aboriginal cultures around the world as if, and froze them in time. So when they wrote their ethnographies, they did not write about the way these people were now. And that was anthropology when I studied it at the doctoral level. They were still writing about the way these Chippewa lived in Cheyenne. And I was interested in change. So my major is urban anthropology. It didn't exist until 2 years before I got into it. And I had people, when I looked for jobs, say, the only thing you're dealing with is facts. Because I studied squatter settlements in Southeast Asia to try and help get medical stuff. Anyway, so change. At the end of her life, she's telling her grandson, who's asking her questions. Now, yeah, she's telling him stuff. And she says, grandson, all this change, fire and smoke on this earth. But who you are, that doesn't have to change. You just need to find out who you are. And I won't spoil it. She says, I am a Indian. She found out who her father was. And so were you. Now, I have found in Alaska, and it's going around in America, a lot of Native Americans are mixed, 60%, 70%, a lot. But to be accepted as a Native American, you have to ignore that white part or that non-Native part. And I think that's wrong. And I have raised that in public a little bit. And a lot of Native leaders, they want to skip that. But I had a Native woman come up and said, I'm so glad you asked that question. I was asking the speaker, why can't you acknowledge your other part and still be Indian? This woman came up and said, last summer I went and my relatives are Scottish. And I went to meet them. And I loved it. Why can't I tell my kids they're both? So I had to be careful. At the end of the book, she does have a line. We're all half and half something. The 4 parts were important to me in order to help me understand, to allow a reader to understand where they're going. I did that kind of after I have the whole thing written. And by the way, I wrote 2 novels and then I took 40%, threw them away and put them together. So anyway, I don't know if I answered your question, but
no, you did. It's very good you came back to that second question, because I agree with you. It looks like the sectioning into 4 pieces is after the fact, and that doesn't actually matter. In other words, it doesn't have to be organic. I think it's a useful device for a reader to follow what is a very not complicated narrative. It's a narrative full of detail and episode, and that's, I think, one of its great strengths. The other great strength that you've sort of alluded to, and I think it makes this novel really a delight to read, is that it happens to focus on 2 things that are so characteristic, in my judgment, of American literature: a fascination with home and a fascination with journeying. So the whole time that Alice is journeying, she's actually fascinated with the idea of needing to find a home. And she finds the home, right? In a sense, it's a trading post. But of course, the trading post is not actually, I don't think I'm spoiling it, not really talked much at all about in this novel. Towards the end it is, but not very much. Just interesting. Kerry, it looks like we have spent an hour talking, I think.
We've just scratched the surface. God, I really
am
amazed with what you picked up.
So I will have to tell the audience that I really encourage you to buy this book, read it, give copies to friends, pass it around. It's extraordinarily engaging and deep novel that frankly requires more than one reading, and that's probably the other point, right?
Wow.
Yeah, really.
Really?
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah.
Final comment.
Like, when you have those English professor traps, you have those sort of 5 Odyssean things in there. And I didn't flunk, but I think I only got 3 out of 5, which is a little bit embarrassing. Like, I forgot Homer. Well, of course it's Homer.
I will just share this one other thing for writers. When you write, sometimes over your shoulder is somebody reading it, and it's like, well, I don't want to offend them. Like, there's my mother, my father, Native, all these people, the proper, all this stuff. I would, to free myself, I would go to one book, one over and over again. Canterbury Tales, 13th century. And I would read this vile stuff. And it's like, if Chaucer could say this in the 13th century,
Yes.
I have permission
Yes, you do.
to blow the lid off of the proper. Anyway, I had fun writing it, and I could learn. I mean, someday we should talk and you can tell me more about what's in there. I don't know all that's in there, to tell you. I mean,
I'd be happy to.
you take it apart and I could figure it out. But
So, Kerry, do you want to entertain us just a bit more and maybe read one more passage? And then
it's real short, and it continues where we were. My stepfather raised me like a boy, taught me to hunt, feel at home in woods, talk sign with Indians we came across. He showed me how to blow through tree bark to make rabbit sounds for my snare, walk barefoot in snow to get my feet tough, jump naked in river ice holes, wrap warm in hide with the hair turned inside. I knew the difference between wolf and cougar tracks, to shut my eyes when I trapped in moonlight, so my eyes got no glow. In a knife fight, how to hold the blade up, kick an enemy in the belly and find his throat with my knife if he didn't drop his. Ma cut my hair short like a boy in our log cabin, and that way she didn't have to worry none about washing and fixing curls. Long hair might get caught on brush when I hunted. I learned to shoot beaver eye at 50 paces, keep the shot away from the hide, get a hide soft by chewing the skin, tan scraped out deer hide with my pea. Had me a good time. Indian white blood in me made my skin look like a fair-skinned doe's. Winters. Summers, I got skin dark as wet cedar. After my womanhood began, my bosoms stuck out under my deerskin tunic, hid them best I could. Embarrassed me to look like that.
so much, Kerry. It's been delightful. Thank you, everybody, for watching or listening. Take care.
Thanks all. Thanks, Toby. Adios.